is November 3rd, 2020. It's election day in the United States. And Hrvoje Morić and myself are going to try to cover that thing, talking to activists, journalists, other people that make an effort to make the world a better place. This is Potkaars, which is Dutch, pot with candle. If you say it quickly, it sounds like a podcast. That's what it is. That's me. This is my co-host, Hrvoje Morić. Hey, Hrvoje.
Yeah, hey, what's up? I don't got any such gimmicks such as that, but you know.
Welcome. I'm in the Netherlands, which is in Europe. Where are you?
I'm everywhere. So I was in Kazakhstan. I'm now in Mexico. I don't know where I'll be next, but you know, on the outskirts of the U.S. empire down here in Mexico.
Okay. We have our first guest in the waiting room. I'm going to admit Kristinn Hrafnsson, who is the current, interim editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks. And we have a whole host of guests lined up. We were slightly nervous doing this live. See if we can pull it off. And see what happens when Kristinn joins us. I have admitted him. So we're recording this through Zoom. There you go. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You haven't slept either yet.
Not yet, but it's only 1 a.m. in the morning, so it's not bad. It's not. I prepared for this, and it's a bit of a unique night, isn't it? So
exactly. So I'm Rico Brouwer. I'm in the Netherlands. This is
Rico.
Yeah, we have met.
Yeah.
We have.
All right.
Yeah, you wouldn't recall. So in February, you were sent out of the courtroom, and you were grumpy and walking to the fence. And I wasn't allowed in on the courtroom, so I was outside with the protesters with the tents, and you stepped up there, and we did a little interview.
Right through the fence, right?
Through the fence, that was me. So this is me, Rico from Amsterdam. Hrvoje.
I'm Hrvoje. I'm in Mexico right now. So.
Nice to meet you in Mexico. Hi.
All right. So we're going to talk about the legal proceedings, the extradition case of Julian Assange, how that was in February and how that was last month when you were in court for a month. But this is election night. My first question would be, do you feel Julian Assange, his verdict, his freedom depends on the outcome of tonight?
I can never be certain about that, and we are very hesitant to count on it. It is, of course, noteworthy that we are arguing, and we are arguing in court in Julian's case, that this was a very political indictment, political persecution against him by the Trump administration. It was known after Trump came to power that the Obama administration had, for years and years, investigated, tried to find an angle on indicting Julian, but didn't find any that passed the New York Times problem, so-called. That is, there was no difference between what WikiLeaks did and what New York Times did. So they decided not to prosecute Julian. We learned that, of course, after Trump came to power from inside the Justice Ministry in the U.S. So just that fact, it sort of highlights and shows that it's a political process. However, the journalists have not been able to squeeze out of Joe Biden any commitment when it comes to Julian Assange, and whether actually he will revert to the previous position of the Obama administration if, as the numbers are indicating, he is going to be the winner of this election. If Trump stays in, which seems rather likely if you are believing the poll numbers, which everybody should take with a grain of salt, with a back history in mind, things will continue. So it is. I've learned not to expect anything positive. Basically, we have seen such a pile up of negative outcomes throughout the years, and now 10 years, that I cannot allow myself to be hoping to a positive outcome. And in essence, it would be absurd to think that in this extraordinary case with so much at stake that you would be having to count on the voters in the US maybe narrowly putting Biden in power. And still, we don't know the outcome of that in terms of what he will do to Julian. Will he, when he takes power and if he wins in January, appoint somebody in the Justice Department that will totally change the course? They have invested heavily in the process, the DOJ, so it's probably going to be very hard to sort of roll back on that one.
All right. So
emphasize. I mean, everything in this case is just so loaded with political input. It is. A blind man can see this is a political prosecution, and thereby Julian a political prisoner in fighting basically a persecution. And even today, we got additional evidence supporting that. A day before the election, a new version of the Mueller report was published, which had a lot of things that were redacted when the report came out firstly exposed. So why did this happen the day before the election? I mean, there were entire pages blacked out in the original Mueller report. And we knew that this was chapters that were involving the WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. So, and today we are reading this extraordinary unredacted account 1.5 years later, where it is exposed that, of course, they didn't find any wrongdoing. They didn't find any collusion with the purported criminal activity of purported Russians or what have you. There was nothing there to indict upon. And they tried everything in the book. They looked at everything, and they didn't. We don't have the evidence. Yeah. So it begs the question, because the Mueller report came out before Julian was arrested in a very politically charged atmosphere, just a few months before the invasion, the allowed invasion in the Ecuadorian embassy. Why was this redacted? Why is it necessary to redact a part of a public outcome of a report like that, where it says, we didn't find any criminality? It's amazing.
Well, one of the reasons I've invited you here is to get into that personal account also of what happened in court last month, and we're going to do that in a few minutes. But also, well, you're a journalist, and you're a journalist with one of the most, maybe the most independent news outlet that there is, like that's WikiLeaks. Before we go into the trial of Julian Assange in London, another question on Trump and Biden. Do you feel press freedom will be affected either way if one or the other were elected? Are your hopes on either one, or?
Well, it takes a bit of a long answer, because as a journalist, my entire working life, I've been absolutely appalled to see how the journalism has been damaged by the mainstream media institutions in the last 4 years. Yeah. It is appalling to see. I mean, before 4 years ago, we had very partisan media on the right wing. And let's focus just on the US, but the US media is very influential on the media in the world. And I mean, when I was growing up, people looked at the US media as a bastion of quality journalism under the protective umbrella of the First Amendment. What happened after 2016, we saw the sort of the right-wing leaning media, sort of the liberal leaning media, absolutely lose their bearings and jump on the so-called Russiagate wagon, and which included attacks on WikiLeaks. And some people might say this was just an expose of something that was hidden before, and now just the mask was off. But it's been appalling. I mean, how on earth is anybody going to trust the mainstream media in those quarters, and not just in America, because this is an effect all over the world, and especially on the British media, obviously, where the media is so obviously partisan and without any. It's quite okay for media to be partisan in their editorial policy, but in reporting, I mean, they had no reservation in publishing absolute false reports about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and it was really hurtful. Even The Guardian, now almost 2 years ago, put out such a fabricated report on the front page, and it's still there. Nobody believes it's true. Not even the author believes it's true, because he left it out of a book that he published this summer about the same subject. Yeah. But it's still there. And that is what's so frustrating. But on the other hand, it amplifies the need for WikiLeaks and the ideology that WikiLeaks is based upon. Yeah. It amplifies the need to get the act together. Will things get better after the election if Biden wins? There is a lot of soul searching to be done in journalistic circles. There's a lot of cleaning up to do if the media will have to regain their trust. Now, on the other hand, if the case against Julian is continued and the fight is not won in this first round, which I think is rather unlikely, I mean, in the magistrate court, it will go on to appeal in the new year, I'm sure. That is a huge blow to the journalism world all over the world, a huge blow, and basically a watershed. And it comes on top of all the difficulties that the journalists have been facing with diminishing funds, with the attacks associated with the rise of the extreme right, etc., etc. Journalists are afraid now. They are not tackling power, and they are getting too close to comfort to those that they are supposed to be basically watching over and barking when they're doing some wrong things. Yeah. In what world is it acceptable when the liberal media that sort of supports the Democratic Party in the US has hired a string of former intelligence chiefs as commentators on politics, and when they are relying on the CIA as truths? Have they forgotten the words of Mike Pompeo, who actually admitted, when he was CIA director, he was on record and he was just like jolly saying, "I'm amazed, because, when I became head of this agency, I had to get accustomed to the fact that our business is lying." And you have CNN, CNBC, other media hiring people from these institutions, basically professional liars as commentators. We have a Clapper who lied in front of Congress with impunity when he was called because of the Snowden, before the Snowden revelations. He lied about mass surveillance. And he said, and he just shrugged and said, "Well, it was the best truthful or the least untruthful version of that I could give," or some bullshit like that. Yeah. This is a person who is now a reliable commentator for journalists. That's extraordinary. So we live in extremely precarious world, and I fear very much for the future of journalism on so many fronts. One
of the reasons that I was in London that first week was to see why such news doesn't make it to the Dutch news outlets, to television. So I wanted to see if there are any reporters, and talk to those guys. And I figured out, there was one. There was one official reporter from Dutch state television, like the Dutch BBC, the NOS. But he was there only for the Monday morning. And you were in court. And the Monday morning, that's when the Americans presented their case. So he reported on that, went on national radio, and that's it. He went off to report on Brexit the rest of the week. Now, the big leg of the extradition case was in September. You were there. I was not. But what I saw online is that you were not let in at all at the start. My question to you is a personal question. So what is your personal biggest memory of that month in court? Was it a fair trial? How are you going to look back on this?
It took me almost 2 weeks of reflection after that month ended, because it was such an intensive period to actually get my head around what the hell happened in that courtroom.
Yeah.
And I have to, my basic finding after it was that, in fact, this was not Julian Assange on trial. This was our civilization on trial. There were evidence after evidence presented there that could, with each and every evidence, should have been sufficed to throw this case out. And you somehow knew, because of the favoritism of the magistrate court judge towards the prosecution, towards the Americans, that it wouldn't suffice. It was such a strong evidence on so many levels that it would take me just half an hour to go through the details of it. But it was a very depressing and shocking experience to be in court there. But also, in a way, you had to be witness there to these witnesses that were presenting their case, such a strong case about the justice that was found or because of the revelations by WikiLeaks. The fact that there was no harm, the fact that there was not WikiLeaks blame, if you could say so, that the unredacted diplomatic cables had to be released, etc., etc. And the simple fact that the treaty between the two countries just bans extradition on political grounds, and espionage is a political ground, if anything. So, I mean, there were piles and piles of arguments that were so strong that anybody, a 10-year-old could have sit in the courtroom and take notes and say, this is absurd. This is Kafkaesque. This is Orwellian. You have to go into all the cliches to express it. And I don't know if I think about 2 weeks ago there was quite an interesting film on Netflix that I watched. It's about the trial of the Chicago 7, the individuals that were brought before a judge after the election of 1968. We're talking about 50 years ago. And where they wanted to put them in, the federal government wanted to put them in prison, the Nixon, newly come to power, for inciting riots in Chicago before the Democratic Convention there. And they actually put in a new district attorney in the DOJ to push the case. And it had all the elements that I had been witnessing in courts before, just in September. A biased judge, evidence that was flimsy at best, etc., etc. And it was just like a flashback, and you started to think, my God, this is we are in a worse state than under the Nixon administration. And actually, Daniel Ellsberg, the leaker of the Pentagon Papers, he testified in Julian's case, and he said, if I had been attacked legally under the conditions of today, I would not have seen a light of day in my life. So we are much worse off than under the Nixon administration or the 60s. And so how far back do we go to find anything equivalent to the McCarthy era of the 50s, or to the early 20th century, when the Espionage Act was introduced, and it was introduced basically as a tool to cause protest against U.S. participation in World War I. And what followed was the most, repressive regime against any protest in the U.S. And everybody admits that. And that's the reason why the Espionage Act was basically shelved, and because it was an extremely repressive act against freedom of expression. So what is happening now, 100 years later, is being used against a publisher and a journalist. And if that's not a warning sign to the world, I mean, nothing is. I mean, we are in an extremely precarious time. So that is my reflection of what happened in the courtroom.
Thank you.
And
it may not even be a strong enough warning sign. I called the Dutch Journalist Association, asked them why there was no journalist at all in that month in September. They were not there. There was no reporting done at all from the Netherlands, and they repeated the same rhetoric that you referred to. So, Assange, well, he did put people into jeopardy. It's a complicated case. There was thing with Sweden. They were just regurgitating that story. Okay, enough on that. What I wanted to ask you also, it's been now a month. So can you describe how is Julian Assange doing? What are his conditions? How is he doing?
Well, I mean, he's in prison, in a supermax prison, or maximum security prison under COVID. I mean, it's not ideal. He's not able to see anybody. Everything is in lockdown again, and in basically under terrific circumstances. I mean, it's a horrible place. I mean, it's only a few days ago, one of the few people he had some interaction with inside Belmarsh prison, he committed suicide. And, you know, this is, it is a horrible place. And what awaits him on the other side if he's extradited is even worse. I mean, that is just an isolation in a 6 by 8 foot cell for the rest of his life, probably in isolation without meeting anybody. So this is, it's what he does, and I have not been able to talk to him since the trial, but I hear of him from the intermediaries and the mother of his children, his fiancée, that he's still in a fighting spirit. There is the case is still ongoing of a sort, because the final submission by his lawyers are due on Friday. So he is attempting to take part in that procedure, which is difficult because it's not easy just to, you don't email documents back and forth. You have to, the lawyers have to go fetch a computer to the prison authorities. They have to load onto the computer that the documents have to be PDFs, a computer that the prison authorities gave, and then it has to be shipped back to the prison. The prison inspects it, and sometimes it doesn't deliver for days. So it's not a quick process. But he takes part in that, and of course verbally over telephone is involved in that process. So he's still fighting. He's an extraordinarily resilient individual, but this is, of course, is taking a great toll, and it would on anybody who has gone through these ordeals.
So later on in this broadcast event that we're doing, I asked a Dutch lawyer to reflect on what she saw happening in this trial. So we will go into more detail on those court proceedings there. But just one example that I want to make here, just to be a little bit, to bring it with a little humor, if I may. So Rvoji, you're in Mexico. I'm in the Netherlands, and you're in Iceland, I believe. So yeah. I am running a low-budget, high-definition video audio stream that has so far worked flawlessly. I mean, we're communicating. Now, if I can pull this off with a couple of $100 or euros or whatever, how was the video feed from the courtroom to journalists and international observers? Would you please describe in detail what went on there?
It was absolutely, as you say, it was almost comical to watch, because we're talking about an empire, former empire at least, and and a country with resources. It was constantly failing. It had to be the voice would drop out, the feed would crash. And sometimes there was just not an ability to connect at all. And the audio quality was such that nobody could hear what was going on the side. It was like I don't know. It was amazing. We're talking about a society that has been working under COVID restriction, and every school child is now able to work under with these measures with the video conferencing tool. And the courts were not able to keep up with that. It was extraordinary, and it just amazes me. I was on the verge of calling my colleagues who were very technically apt and basically offer them assistance.
Yeah, exactly.
And it did have an effect because it delayed until the end. There was no time left, and very important testimony. Instead of hearing that via video link, had to be read in writing, and even it had to be read in summary instead of in full. Or, for example, I mean, we were going to hear the testimony of El Masri, the rendition victim that was picked up on the streets and flown to a black site, I think in Poland and in Bagram. It was tortured, sodomized, and after a few months they discovered to the CIA that they had done a mistake, so they dumped him off the side of the road in Albania, I think, and he got back to Germany where he was residing, and nobody believed him. They thought he had just vanished and took off. It took him years to get some justice. And the reason why he got justice was because there were documents in the WikiLeaks release that supported his case, namely that the Americans were putting extreme pressure on the German government, and they were threatening the German government that if they didn't let this die, because at that time the identity of the CIA operatives was known, and a case was brought against them locally in Bavaria, I think, and the German government was under pressure to basically issue an international arrest warrant, and that's when the US stepped in and said there will be consequences if you do this, and it was quashed. So this is a document that was able to prove his case, the elements of it, and the extreme political pressure stopping him from getting justice in his case, and that was in his favor. So, I mean, this is one of the many cases where the documents have brought justice to people that have really suffered. And we couldn't hear this testimony. The video link broke, and it couldn't be fixed. And in the end, a written submission, and the prosecution, the American lawyers, were arguing that, well, we need to basically concur on what is read. They wanted to redact the written report that was submitted. And at that point in the courtroom, I mean, Julian basically broke his silence and said, I will not have a CIA torture victim being censored in this courtroom. And the judge silenced him. I mean, it was just enough is enough.
But I read that. So I was seeing that from the Netherlands and seeing it happen. The impression I got was that Julian Assange had obviously no authority at all. He was in the back in a glass cage, but he had moral authority. He stood up and said, well, I will not have this in my courts. That's what I heard him say. I will not have this in my courtroom. You will hear this testimony. So he had moral authority. And
even though the judge had been very negative when he had expressed himself before towards him, I mean, there was a sliver of shame that I felt, and everybody, of course, understood how shameful this was. You don't silence a torture victim.
Exactly.
In any courtroom, it's just shameful, and I mean, everybody in the courtroom basically went silent because we understood the implication of this. But this is an anecdotal evidence of how flawed the entire process was. And you were saying that your colleagues was talking about, well, all the damage, all the harm done by WikiLeaks exposure. It's been I mean, it's been even admitted by Pentagon under oath in trial in the Chelsea Manning trial 7 years ago.
Oh, yeah. I'm just saying this anecdotally. So this is what the Dutch Federation of Journalists gives me back. So this is where we are.
But they are not alone in this. I mean, we're still hearing echo of this in the media. So you can imagine the power of the undermining process in the character assassination has been going on all through these years. And especially in the UK, it's been better in many countries on the mainland, in France and Germany. And I don't speak Dutch, so I'm not so sure about the Dutch media in general, but there have been some positive reporting there. But overall, in the UK media, it was just became okay to kick him because it was open season and it was endorsed by all parties. So it was a collective effort by all institutions of government, the judiciary, and the media. And that is what Niels Melzer, the special rapporteur on torture of the United Nations, basically discovered when he reluctantly looked into the case, because he wasn't that interested in this guy, Julian Assange. I mean, he's got plenty of cases that he's being asked to look into. You can imagine that. Yeah. And he was astonished, and he said the most honest thing by Niels Melzer was that he admitted that he had been under bias. He had been biased by the media and the general atmosphere towards Julian Assange. And he said, if it happens to me, who is a professor, who's an expert in this field, to see through the biases that are being presented in society, you can imagine about. I mean, that speaks volume. So what about the ordinary people, the people in the streets? What about the media operatives?
All right. We are going to continue to talk about the trial of Julian Assange later on this night. For now, we have to leave it here. Our next guest, but I don't want you to leave just yet. Just there's one more question, but I want our next guest, Mr. John Robino, to be here. We're moving into a different topic of finance. Now, since you're from Iceland, I have to ask you this question, but I'm going to admit him to the room. John Rubino, and we'll do introductions later, but maybe you can hear the question, because you are from Iceland, and the reason that hello, John. Let's see.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, we hear you. Yeah.
Okay, this is a bit of an odd order, but we'll do introductions in a moment. We're finishing up with Kristinn Hrafnsson, but I wanted you to hear this question. This is a bridge into your topic where we're going to continue the discussion in. So he's from Iceland. Now, the reason that I turned activist was your bank. So all the savings I had, there wasn't that many, was with iSave Landsbanki. And what I wanted to ask you, has Iceland learned or improved from the 2008 crisis with your bankers and all of that, your political leaders that messed up Landsbanki? As I feel we have another 2008 coming on steroids. So how have the Icelanders dealt with it, and have you learned? Kristinn, what will be your opinion?
Yes, there have been some learning process, but probably more should have learned. And it's been astonishing. Of course, we were extremely lucky in economic terms that with a tourist boom, we were lifted out of the depression after the spectacular collapse of all the major banks in Iceland. Who, it's a tiny country they live in, but the turnover of the banks overall was, I think, 11 times the GDP of the country. I mean, that I think outmeasures Switzerland by at least fivefold or something. I'm not sure about the numbers, but it was outrageous, and of course it hurt people in your country and elsewhere, savers who were hurt. What can I say? I mean, there was an extraordinary work of reconciliation and investigation and a report by a special commission by the parliament, which looked into every aspect of society. There was a special prosecutor's office to set up, and if it counts for something, I think of half of all the people that were put in jail after the 2008 banking crisis in the world, half of them were Icelandic. So at least there was some justice being done there, and so it lingers on, and it also lingers on in people's mind that they don't want to it happen again, and they are willing to go out on the street. And they know the power of protest and when enough is enough. It happened again in 2016. So in the Panama Papers, you had 10% of the population within a day of the release of the Panama Papers going down to the center of Reykjavik. It's only 27,000 people, but it's 10%. It's a sizable protest in any country, I would say.
Yeah, excellent.
And people, nobody was throwing stones, and I can tell you there was people from all sections of society, and they were just appalled that their prime minister had been involved in that scandal, and they were just packing the center of Reykjavik, and they stood there in silence. And the message was so clear: get the hell out of there. And he resigned. There was no choice. So the lesson is there. And for me as Icelander, I try to convey the story because it is the only story. It's when everything is sort of dissected, the bottom line is always this, and it still is. We haven't developed any further than that. That when people want justice, they have to physically go and meet and show their determination for change. That is still there.
Kristinn Hrafnsson, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, are you going to stay up the rest of the night or what? What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think it's at least for an hour or two to see how things are progressing.
Yeah, take care. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make.
You think I'm joking? Predator drones. You will never see it coming.
Laat staan dat ik kan ingaan over vuur.